The Tsar dispatched the Baltic fleet to Manchuria, but the British denied them the use of the Suez Canal, and the Russians had to sail around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa. When the Russian Baltic fleet finally arrived in Korea, the Japanese were waiting for them, and out of 38 Russian ships, only 3 made it into port, and the Russians had burned 500,000 tons of coal getting there. The French made the excuse that Britain had threatened France with war if they helped their Russian friends at Port Arthur, and Britain had threatened Russia with war if they used the Suez Canal. But perhaps that's what the Crown had really wanted the whole time. And after the Russian fleet was laid waste in the sneak attack, the British sent the Japanese a lock of Admiral Nelson's hair. And Nelson had been Britain's favorite old Navy hero who had been prone to seasickness. The Japanese killed 50,000 Russians, and the Russians killed 60,000 Japanese in the War of 1905. And 20,000 Chinese died, and the dead Koreans remained uncounted. And the Japanese took over the Sakhalin Islands, and Teddy Roosevelt stepped in to broker a truce. The Japanese got Korea and the Sakhalin Islands, but would lose both after Hitler's war, and the Russians were not forced to pay war reparations to Japan in 1905. And the people of Japan rioted over that, claiming that the easy terms for Russia was because of racism. The British renewed their alliance with Japan in 1905 and again in 1911. Because Japan's full-throttle buildup of their military threatened the British presence in India. So Britain agreed to leave Korea to the mercy of Japan, if the Japanese agreed to leave India alone to the British. And Britain sold an enormous amount of military equipment and technology to Japan in time for the Great War. The deal had included the agreement that the Japanese would protect British ships in the Mediterranean from the Germans, and the Great War would be fought to protect Britain's sea lanes to their poppy plantations in India. The Qing Chinese banned poppy growing again in 1908, and they planned to get rid of all opium in China by 1917, but they excluded the Dowager Empress because she was already addicted. And the British took over 3 states in Siam in 1909, and the English king was declared Emperor of India in 1911, and the Germans sent a gunboat to Agadir. The Black Dragon gang from Japan participated in the overthrow of the Qing dynasty in October of 1911, and by the time of Hitler's war, the Japanese had invented an ingenious fighter airplane called the Zero that had an aluminum shell and was extremely maneuverable, but only at slow speed, so the Zero was unable to outfly the Americans and would be used primarily for suicide missions. America had remitted their share of the Boxer Rebellion debt in 1908 towards scholarships for Chinese students to come to study in America, and the Americans used the rest of it to build a university in Beijing. And Lenin had forgiven his portion of the debt in 1918 in exchange for a little friendship, while the British used their due allotment to build a railroad in China, and the French share went towards opening a bank. China's debt from the Boxer Uprising had almost been wiped out by 1927 and had gone a long way towards modernizing China. And Sun Yat-sen would have been a good and decent leader for China, but he'd been unable to control the military, who were rampaging around China collecting quote-unquote taxes. And when they murdered Sun Yat-sen in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek was put in his place, and Chiang Kai-shek's real name was Chiang Chung-cheng, and Beijing was also Peeping or Peking. Because Churchill had been elected out of office back home in the summer of 1945, right in the middle of the conference at Potsdam, Stalin had come in a hopeful state, and because occupying armies trumped paperwork, the only item on the agenda at Potsdam worth discussion was the upcoming unconditional surrender of Japan. Russia had wanted to do some serious wartime action in the direction of the Japanese islands, having been prevented earlier by agreements with the Allies, so America dropped the bomb on Japan to save the Japanese from a far worse fate at the hands of the Red Army, and Russia declared war on Japan 2 days later. The U.S. dropped the second bomb on day 3 just to give the Russians pause, which it did. Because FDR had not survived the end of the war, only the Big Two were able to attend the Potsdam Conference in August of 1945, to which France tagged along because Britain insisted that France be a fourth wheel at the new Security Council, in order to ensure that a vote among the major powers would always be deadlocked, instead of allowing America and Russia to always hold sway over Britain. If the British wanted to include France, then the U.S. demanded that China be given a seat on the Security Council, even though they were in the middle of a civil war. And at Potsdam in August of 1945, the Russians signed an agreement that if they would be given Manchuria, if they stayed above the 38th parallel in Korea. And this treaty mandated that the U.S. would stay in Japan and in the Philippines, as well as in South Korea and some other places, while the British were free to conduct their business in Indochina and Indonesia. The Japanese had kicked the French out of Vietnam, and after Hitler's war, the British convinced the Japanese to go back home by telling them that the Russians were on the way. And Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam to be a communist republic in September of 1945, while nobody in particular was watching. The British, specifically Admiral Mountbatten, had been busying themselves in securing a grip on the Golden Triangle, specifically Burma, to bolster what was left of the British economy, and the poppy-growing regions were up in the hills of northern India, in Thailand and eastern Burma and western Laos, while the lowlands of Vietnam were not useful to anyone in the drug trade. The British turned the south over to the French, but not until February 1946 did the Chinese allow the French to regain the north. 20th Century Russia, page 428. Uncle Ho had great difficulty with his new job because his mentors back in Russia had signed that paper at Potsdam agreeing to let Britain have hegemony over Southeast Asia. And it must have been some kind of a drug deal that was so favorable to the French that they agreed to let Uncle Ho rule the north of Vietnam in May of 1946, or in the alternative, Uncle Ho took North Vietnam away from the French, depending upon which historian you're reading. And hostilities soon broke out as all-out jungle war raged between the French and the Vietnamese for the next 8 years. While the British were solidifying their opium roots in Burma after India was granted its independence in August of 1947, the Vietnamese farms were collectivized right out from under the noses of the colonial commissioners. And the best Stalin could do was to tell them to call the Chinese, who responded right away by sending over 1 million Chinese wearing NVA uniforms to fight for the freedom of the Vietnamese in their quest to get rid of all colonizers. Independence for India had meant war with Islamic Pakistan now that the British weren't around to keep the Muslims in line. But what price freedom? Britain had tried to grow their own opium poppies, but the flowers were very fragile and grew only in sheltered mountains, safe in their quiet, calm environment, without the harsh wind and weather that came from the sea around the British Isles. Opium poppies need long days to grow with at least 12 hours of sunlight, and the poppy takes 90 days to make flower. Then the petals fall in 3 days, leaving a capsule that is wearing a crown. Opium poppies are usually white, but they can be purple, pink, red, or blue. and poppies don't need fertilizer, and they don't need extra water, and they don't suffer from fungus or insects, and they can grow taller than people. The poppy harvest takes 30 days, with each capsule making opium for 12 days, and the drug is collected by slicing the capsule with a sharp knife or a razor blade, allowing the sap to ooze out, and then these poppy tears are carefully scraped off by hand. While the reason the poppy makes opium is still a mystery, it may be so that animals will come back for more when the seeds are ready, having enjoyed the effect of the pods. Because if too many green pods were eaten, the poppy would be consumed into extinction by animals feeding upon them, and eating up too many of the young pods would kill animals with an opium overdose before the poppy could be eradicated, preventing the poppy from going the way of the dinosaurs. Poppy capsules were found in prehistoric caves, and cultivation of poppies had begun in the Balkans or around the Black Sea, and Constantinople would become the central hub of the trade route for opium sales. The Turks used a crescent-shaped scythe to harvest the poppy field crops in Turkey, so it was called the Golden Crescent, and Turks fed the remainder of the plant to their cows to make the best yogurt in the world. The Turquoise Coast and its valleys, in which thrives an abundance of exotic vegetation. Snow-capped peaks tower proudly above. You can swim here through the end of November in the literally turquoise blue water. Discover for yourself the miles upon miles of fine sandy beaches, concealed grottos, and fragrant pine forests tumbling down the mountain slopes to the red cliffs. An ideal setting for any tourist, especially for the amateur archaeologist, since history lurks everywhere in these stones. The area is further blessed with shady pine forests, lakes, and one of the world's most perfect climates. Fodor's Turkey, 1985, page 226 and 7. Brave Christian crusaders had marched off to the Holy Land to bring back the opium trade after the Moslems had made travel to Turkey too dangerous. And the Crusaders marched into Turkey, not just to conquer the ungodly heathen, but to reopen the gates of heaven. Turkey was where the Blessed Virgin Mary had moved and lived for the rest of her life. And the ancient city of Troy was in Turkey, where the beautiful Helen had come to give opiated wine to the Greek soldiers who stayed in their tents drinking poppy juice and thereby lost the war. And Homer was supposed to have written under the influence himself, because the work is steeped in opium, a sensitivity to sounds, and awareness of the intricacies of color and light, the visual images, the passage of elongated time, the sense of desolation and vast seascape, and the presence of a spectral woman, all smack of opium, not to mention the central theme of an evil deed, persecution by a ghostly apparition, and a catalogue of horrors. Opium, a History, page 44. Sumerians grew poppies around the Tigris-Euphrates River, and Assyrians called it the joy plant in 4000 BC. And the ancient Egyptians had taught Moses about opium, and poppies were everywhere in Greece. The poison that Socrates drank was opium, while some historians said that Socrates killed himself with water hemlock, but hemlock is only fatal a third of the time and causes vomiting, sweating, respiratory distress, and convulsions with foaming at the mouth, so hemlock was not the drug of choice for any intelligent person like Socrates. The English had learned about opium from the Romans, who stamped poppies onto their coins. And the threat about the Yellow Horde was based on opium, because the Chinese were a quarter of the world's population. Even if you were a 1 in a million type guy, there were 1,000 people just like you. Everyone was afraid of the Chinese after the Mongols had come through over the Silk Road, and it hadn't been simply the number of Mongols that showed up in Europe, but the superhuman strength and stamina they displayed under the influence of opium. When the Mongols retreated back to their homeland, many had stayed to marry into the local tribes in Turkey, and they became expert opium traders. And Marco Polo may have gotten his opium from Turkey in 1271, instead of walking all the way to China, because the Silk Road had become too treacherous for traveling with the onslaught of ever-present Islamic raiders, and even Constantinople itself would be too dangerous for tourists to visit after being lost to Islam in 1453. Syria, Egypt, Persia, North Africa, Spain, and half of India had fallen to the Muslims, while Constantinople was holding them back with Greek fire. By the 14th century, the Islamic Turks controlled Greece and the Crimea, and almost all of the Balkans except for Constantinople. And while the Muslims were fighting among themselves about who would rule the Islamic world, Spain or Baghdad, the Ottoman Turks were able to conquer Baghdad. After Avicenna died of an opium overdose in Iran in 1037, Muslims had taken the drug to Persia, North Africa, Spain, India, and China, and pushing the miracle drug had gone a long way towards making it possible for them to enslave a sizable portion of the known world. No other trade made such a fast profit so easily, and the Kaiser would practice military maneuvers with Russia because he wanted the Tsar prepared to fight the Yellow Horde if they ever got worked up out of Mongolia again. The opium trade surpassed all other business in most countries, and opium was grown in Yugoslavia and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Burma, as well as in Turkey. And the drug went over the Silk Road from the Mediterranean Sea to the Yellow Sea in China. Some historians were convinced that Marco Polo never got any farther than Constantinople, precisely because of the stories he wrote about the journey to China, tall tales he more likely heard from other travelers who had gone to the Far East. And these anecdotes may have been told to him while they were sitting around smoking their hookah pipes, and Marco Polo had written them down as his own experiences because that made the stories more readable. Marco Polo wrote that the great Khan in China wanted him to bring back some anointing oil from Jerusalem, and Marco Polo also claimed to have visited the Golden Triangle in Burma. And Christopher Columbus would own a first edition of the Travels of Marco Polo that had been written in Latin, and Columbus not only wrote comments in the margins of his copy of Marco Polo's book, but after discovering America, Columbus would go to his grave, believing he had reached the land of the great Khan's opium pleasure palace. By the 16th century, the Islamic Turks controlled Syria and Egypt and Hungary and southern Russia. And the Islamists would fight with Russians and Venetians and Persians, and that century a German called Paracelsus, whose real name was Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, went around Europe handing out opium pills, and he also used them heavily on himself. Paracelsus would dissolve opium in alcohol to make a tincture he named laudanum, from the Latin word to praise, and he called opium the stone of immortality. The stone of immortality, and Lewis and Clark would give opium to American Indians in the form of laudanum. Paracelsus was the first to lecture in ordinary German rather than in Latin, and he burned the current medical books in a midsummer night's bonfire, and went on the road with his little opium pills and a two-handed sword with an empty handle holding his personal stash. English sailors launched their ships in search of opium to bring back to their virgin Queen Elizabeth, although many historians said they sailed in search of spices. And opium appears in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and in Shakespeare's Othello, and both his Midsummer's Night Dream, and The Tempest are opium fantasies. Byron, Keats, Shelley, and Sir Walter Scott took opium, and Dickens took it later in life, writing his last book, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, about opium, and that book would remain unfinished. William Wilberforce, who was responsible for abolishing the slave trade, was addicted to opium, and there was so much use of it in England that being opiated was accepted as a normal part of being alive. Opium was sold at the grocery store and the dry goods store and in the feed store and at every tavern in 1850, and doctors dosed hysterical women with opium and used it to treat the insane, and women used it to prevent pregnancy, and doctors came to believe that women liked opium more than men, but that was just because they gave more of it to women. People gave it to their babies, and they gave it to their livestock, and they gave it to their children like candy, and many syphilitics used opium to commit suicide. In 1886, Lord Randolph Churchill compared Gladstone's rhetoric on Home Rule to, quote, the taking of morphia. The sensations are transcendent, but the recovery is bitter beyond experience, close quote. In actual fact, Churchill's attack was close to the bone, for Gladstone took laudanum in his coffee, apparently to increase his rhetorical powers when addressing Parliament. Opium, a History, page 75. Teddy Roosevelt called the first international convention in 1909 to talk about Chinese opium, since the opium problem had been growing in America, and people were openly going to Chinese opium dens instead of staying at home behind closed doors to take their own home cures. So many Chinese had been hired to build the railroads that Americans started to think of addiction to opium as a foreign disease, and in 1874 the Senate chaplain Dr. Newman said, "We need them as laborers, we need them as servants, we need them as citizens, for in that great region of the Missouri to the Golden Gate there is less than 1 million of white inhabitants. We therefore bid them welcome, but we cannot bid them welcome as opium smokers." Opium, a History, page 194. People were afraid of the Chinese because they regularly used opium, and it was seen as an alien drug and something contrary to the American way of life, and Congress would pass immigration laws to keep out non-European immigrants from 1921 to 1924. Chinese had been hired by the boatload because they worked very hard with the help of their opium. And the Chinese opened poppy bars where people could lay down and nod off. And the word hippie came from getting bruised hips after laying on hard benches in these Chinese opium dens, and the word junkie came from the flat-bottomed boats used by the Chinese who were smuggling opium. Mr. Booth said the Chinese imported 200,000 pounds of opium into America in 1883. And he said that rich young women would come to smoke in the opium dens and end up falling in love with the Chinese men. So the phrase to have a yen for something came from these Chinese opium parlors. What was worse, people were going to the Chinese opium dens to have fun, which was not the same as being medically addicted for health reasons. And having fun with opium was seen as a moral question, and the president thought it was disgraceful. Even worse, opium and sex seems to go together, because people were laying down in the opium dens while dressed for bed, or wearing their best smoking jackets, and even more incriminating was the fact that most prostitutes used it, not just to numb themselves to the sex slavery in which they were engaged, but to render their customers insensate, so they could be robbed. California would try to get rid of the Chinese opium dens in 1913 by burning the opium and throwing the heirloom pipes into the fire, some of which were hundreds of years old, while Britain would pass the Defense of the Realm Act in 1916 because they needed to control the supply for their wounded soldiers during the Great War, and the drug was a mainstay in the British Army. The Chinese had eaten opium raw until Europeans brought tobacco around 1620, after which the Chinese smoked opium mixed with tobacco. And as Chinese cities grew, the demand for opium increased faster than Chinese farmers could grow it. So the British East India Company found a lucrative market in China for their opium that was being grown on the poppy plantations in India. Christian missionaries from the American YMCA had gone to China to try to cure opium addiction, and addicts would be given concoctions that contained opium, and the Chinese had learned to equate Christianity with opium, so the U.S. government sent ordinary people, rather than officials, to help with the problem in China. Visiting opium dens had become part of the tourist trip for rich travelers, especially those with more money than just the tourists going on the Orient Express Railroad to Turkey. And the foreign devils coming into China just seemed to make the problem worse, if that were at all possible. The Chinese had studied the stars and used the wheel and built houses out of brick and knew about magnetism, while the Germans were still running loose in the woods. And the wise man Confucius had been writing Chinese poetry in 500 BC, while the Nordics were still using runes. The Chinese invented gunpowder when Charlemagne was on the throne, but they only used it for fun, and it would take a German to invent the gun. While war for the Chinese was more of a game, and they considered Europeans to be barbaric because they were always fighting with each other using force instead of strategy. Vasco da Gama got to China by going around Africa in 1498, and the Chinese gave these Portuguese the Isthmus of Macau across the bay from Hong Kong, and Vasco would call the island of Taiwan the Beautiful, or Formosa. And Vasco's friends built warehouses to store opium, and the Spanish came and took it away from them in 1580, even though the Pope had drawn a line around the globe in 1493 to keep his faithful children, the Portuguese and the Spanish, from fighting with each other over the opium trade. The Virgin Queen Elizabeth sent ships to China in 1596. But they were shipwrecked, and the British East India Company was born in 1600 and took ships to China in 1635, but they were turned away by angry Chinese and angry Spaniards. The captain of the Dragon sailed from England and shot up some Chinese forts in 1637, so they let him come ashore and spend some money buying Chinese goods after he wrote them an apology with a gun held to his head. And trade continued with the Europeans until 1685, when the British East India Company gained a monopoly and were operating 13 warehouses in China. The British government would take away their monopoly in 1698, but gave it back within 10 years. And the Chinese wanted only money from Britain because the English had no trade goods, for which the Chinese had a yen. So pounds sterling were flooding into China, and that money was being used to buy opium. The Chinese emperor banned opium except for medical reasons in 1729, and he started strangling dealers while the opium smokers were not prosecuted, but he failed to ban the import of opium because he was collecting taxes on it, and corrupt officials prevented the ban on opium sales from having much effect. Parliament gave the British East India Company a share of the government in 1774 because the company had grown so large that it had its own army and had completely taken over India, and the growing of opium on plantations in India was encouraged for selling to the Chinese to get some pounds sterling back. An English boat that had come ashore from the Lady Hughes fired a salute by accident that killed 2 Chinese boatmen in 1784. And the gunner was tried in Chinese court and sentenced to death by strangulation, and then another sailor refused to get on his knees in 1793 to touch his forehead to the ground before the emperor, and he said he would bow to the emperor as an Englishman but not as a Chinaman. China banned opium again in 1796 and then banned it for good in 1799. But the lower Chinese officials continued to wink at the trade, and by 1840 there were millions and millions of addicts in China. The British East India Company had an exclusive license to trade with China, but their charter lapsed in 1833, although it didn't matter because by that time the company had become more powerful than the British government, and the East India Company was its own country and could coin money and make war and run their own courts, and their seamen had faced the ocean and scurvy and pirates, and so a few government officials did not scare them in the least. While sailors of the East India Company would get drunk and be robbed, that was just part of the job. And some sailors went ashore in 1839 and got drunk and started a fight when the villagers ran out of wine, and they killed a man and were put on trial, but the murder went unsolved. The next month, there was some more shooting, and 3 months later, there was a real naval engagement on the 4th of July in 1840 that included gunboat diplomacy because the British had more naval firepower than the Chinese. 2 opium wars followed in 1840 and 1860, and the British fought for free trade while the Chinese fought against opium. The Chinese emperor had 3 sons, and all of them were opium addicts, and all of them died from it. And the Chinese emperor could not believe that Queen Victoria would allow such a terrible thing to happen, so he sent her a long letter asking her for help. But the letter never reached the Queen because it was intercepted, and those who read the letter thought it was better that they throw it away. After the Opium Wars, business went on as usual, and the Chinese emperor revoked the ban in 1890 to allow the Chinese to grow their own instead of buying it from the British. And the Chinese started starving because they wanted to grow opium instead of growing food. While the emperor wanted to stop the importation of opium, his new law only made things worse, and by 1900, 1/4 of the population of China was addicted. There would have been only one opium war, but the British East India Company ran into trouble with the Indian Mutiny in 1857, and the British military had to expand enough to take India away from the East India Company in order to put down the Dum-Dum troubles. The Indian Mutiny had started in January of 1857 near Calcutta, when an Indian sailor asked for a drink of water from an Indian soldier above his class, who refused him the drink because it was against his religion to share a cup with someone outside or below his class. And the thirsty sailor said that the caste system was bogus because the British were making their gunpowder cartridges with beef fat, so they were all going to hell for ripping open cartridges with their teeth, and word got out, and the Indian army rioted and mutinied and broke open the jails and rampaged over India for months, killing and mutilating every European in sight. The Crown responded with tens of thousands of British soldiers and managed to take India away from the East India Company. And because the bulk of the British soldiers were sent to India to finally be able to impose taxes on the British East India Company, the French in the Crimea were tasked with the bulk of the fighting in the Crimean War against Russia. Bleeding the French had kept them from imagining that they could re-establish themselves in their previous colonies in India that had once belonged to the French East India Company. And after Britain's troop build-up in the Crimean War, China was just a stone's throw away for them to follow up with Opium War II. Another version of the First Opium War was that some Chinese had tried to crucify a Chinese opium dealer along with some drunken British sailors, and American sailors had intervened and taken down the cross, and 3 months later some British sailors went ashore and got drunk and killed a Chinese opium dealer, while the emperor wanted to make an example of this Chinese dealer who had not been sharing the profits with the emperor. And to make an example of him, the emperor burned a year's worth of opium, and that made prices go sky high from the enormous unmet demand. As a result, the astronomical profit margin made the trade skyrocket even further, and when the 10,000 British soldiers showed up for Opium War II, most of the deaths were from dysentery that could have been cured with the opium now in short supply because the emperor had burned it all up. After the Second Opium War, the British demanded $21 million for the opium the emperor had burned, and because the Chinese had no money, the British were given Hong Kong, and the Crown now had a steady source of substantial tax revenue coming from the poppy plantations in India, and the new policy became keeping up the price by maintaining a monopoly on the trade. The weird thing about the British in China was that they looked down on the Chinese with contempt and treated them like coolies, and the British thought Chinese were inferior and in need of direction from the superior British, while the Chinese in America were real Americans, different but not less than or better, and no matter how many decades of infiltration and manipulation Britain had invested in China, there was ultimately no way to break the bond between the Chinese and the American people. America upheld the Truman Doctrine by fighting the Korean War to show Britain that America was ready and willing to go to war when anyone, anywhere, needed help keeping out the British. MacArthur was not allowed to march into China because the U.S. needed the Chinese strong enough to stop Britain from riding roughshod over mainland China. And it was obvious that the Chinese and the Russians were not blood brothers, and they would not unite in world communist conquest. But the commie domination theory kept a lot of government types busy thinking and writing reports about that possibility. Tito had been on his own in 1948, and the Russians told the Hungarians to get ready to invade Yugoslavia to keep out the British. And they were all ready to roll into Belgrade when the Americans landed in Korea, right in Stalin's backyard. The British had been telling the U.S. in 1950 that the Russians were making the North Koreans go communist in order to divert U.S. attention away from Tito in the Balkans. And after several years and several thousand dead soldiers in the Korean War, the U.S. figured out that the Russians had nothing to do with the Koreans going communist, and neither had the Chinese, but that the North Koreans had figured out communism all by themselves. And it also hit home with American politicians that the Chinese had just been trying to protect China. A victory parade in Red Square was scheduled for June 24th, 1945. I came to Moscow for the occasion. I wanted to watch our troops marching and to rejoice with all the people in the capital of our homeland. Eisenhower came to Moscow too. He stood with us on the Lenin Mausoleum to review the parade. This was the first time I met Eisenhower. Stalin gave a huge banquet. All our military leaders were there. So was Eisenhower. I don't think Montgomery, the English commander, was there. Stalin had formed good relations with Eisenhower and even better ones with Roosevelt. He had bad relations with Churchill and even worse ones with Montgomery. Khrushchev remembers, page 220. Stalin had told the Hungarians to prepare to invade Yugoslavia because Tito had been distancing himself from Moscow and had been having meetings with the British. When Ike invited Nikita Khrushchev to tour America from the 15th to the 27th of September in 1959, the CIA was so incensed by Ike's invitation that they abandoned their testing of LSD and jumped right into direct distribution in order to blame Russia for what would become of the young people in the 60s in America. Mao took care of the opium trade in China in 1949 by heavily taxing opium dens, and addicts were given one opportunity to get over their capitalist imperialist opium problem, and then they were shot. It took China 10 years to cure opium addiction under Mao, but they did it, and they did it the hard way. The wife of the last Chinese emperor was addicted, and they put her in a cage for show, and let her die of neglect and withdrawal while the new communist peasants walked by in long lines to laugh at her. And then they went forth to spread the message by word of mouth that things had most certainly changed in China as far as the opium trade was concerned. Mao published small books so the new communists would have an understanding of the revolution that had come to Red China, and the first were called On Practice and On Contradiction, where Mao quoted Lenin quoting Hegel, and he quoted Marx quoting Feuerbach, and he quoted Stalin quoting Lenin. The new Chinese government made a point of reminding everyone about the evil done by Chiang Kai-shek's secret police, and Chiang Kai-shek had worn a German uniform and had been a good friend of the British. From as long ago as the 13th century, we have records showing that Kublai Khan appointed the Grand Lama of Tibet. The British recognized Chinese suzerainty in 1792, and during Chiang Kai-shek's rule, Washington refused to admit a trade delegation from Tibet until it had obtained visas from the Kuomintang government. China, the country Americans are not allowed to know, page 281. The Chinese thought that Tibet was isolated and backward, close quote. A system of serfdom of an appallingly repressive nature actually prevailed there until it was abolished by the Chinese government in 1959. The so-called Tibetan independence movement was in fact a counter-revolutionary action led by groups of feudal landlords and religious aristocrats with assistance from outside. Let us also add this. One of the first acts of the Chinese government after the liberation of Tibet in 1959 was to prohibit mutilation. It was still the custom there to gouge out eyes, cut off ears, and employ similar brutal punishments. China, the country Americans are not allowed to know, page 280 and 81. "Oh, for God's sake, Wu," I said, "you talk and talk about America, but you know you aren't really saying anything. You people seem to know only what's wrong with America. You know the latest crime statistics down to the latest child murderer. You probably know exactly how many drunks there are in Los Angeles. You know all about our juvenile crime and how we cheat each other and all about Little Rock." China, the country Americans are not allowed to know, page 262. The British had sold the opium from their huge farms in India mainly to China, and the quest for a profitable market price in Europe was complicated by their having to ship the opium all the way from India, while the drug that came from Turkey was not only cheaper but was a superior product. Before the Suez Canal was built, the British were shipping opium to Europe up through the Persian Gulf, then taking it overland through Iraq to the Mediterranean. But the cheaper product was coming directly from Turkey rather than from the Indian plantations, and the Turkish kind not only cost less, it was twice as strong. Opium had been completely available in England until the temperance ladies got going in 1868 with their Poisons and Pharmacy Act. That was more about social control than medical concerns, and the temperance ladies wanted to help the lower classes with their opium problem, especially the Chinese who were smoking it on the docks. The upper classes were not included in the temperance crusade because addiction was a medical rather than a moral problem to the upper classes, whose women were supposed to be sickly and fragile, while lower class working women were assumed to be strong and healthy. Although living conditions for the poor were generally deplorable, with opium nothing was deplorable anymore. The price of opium was a hardship on the poor and was expensive enough to cause trouble for the working man, and one dose cost a shilling, while a working person made 20 shillings a week. Most of the opium coming into England was being used by women raising children who were just like their neighbours but a bit more constipated, and the Crown kept careful track of how much opium was coming into the country so they could collect taxes on it. With the quantity they were able to track, they found that enough opium was being brought in for every person in England to stay stoned for a full day each week, and even more was being smuggled in to avoid the tax. And it would not be until the Poisons and Pharmacy Act that distribution was limited, at least in theory, since the country druggist also ran the post office. By 1900 in England, only pharmacies sold opium, and after the British king was declared the Emperor of India in 1911, and the last Emperor of China was dethroned in 1912, the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913 allowed addicts to be locked up, and in India, Gandhi had first started fighting the colonizers by protesting against opium, because the British government was taxing it too highly. while that crusade would be relegated in the newspapers to being a protest about the tax on salt. A government publication in India, entitled 1923, The Truth About Indian Opium, said, "The prohibition of opium eating in India we regard as impossible. Opium is in virtually universal use throughout India as the commonest and most treasured of the household remedies." Opium, a History, page 186. In China in 1924, Sun Yat-sen did not like that babies were being born addicted, so he declared the death penalty for dealers, and Sun Yat-sen built hospitals for addicts where they could walk in off the street and be given morphine to cure their heroin addiction. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, and General Chiang Kai-shek took over. And Mr. Booth wrote a chapter about Chiang Kai-shek's exploitation of opium, describing how he set up the French-Sicilian-Vietnamese connection. And by the 30s there were 45 million more addicts in China. Chiang Kai-shek tried to recruit the mountain people in the Golden Triangle to fight Mao, but succeeded only in getting plenty of guns into their hands, which were then used to kill each other over the poppy trade. When the Japanese attacked China in 1931, they sent agents ahead of the soldiers to hand out free opium, and the Japanese had requested a clarification of the racial laws being discussed at the League of Nations, but had been met with an assurance of veto. And when the Japanese occupied Shanghai in 1937, America finally gave Mao guns to fight them, and Mao would use those guns later for his revolution. Before their opium trade from India into China over the Rangoon-Burma Road was cut off by the Japanese in May of 1942, the British had begun building their Rangoon-Burma Road in 1937 when Japan invaded mainland China and raped Nanking, since the Japanese now had superiority in the Pacific Ocean and could not be expected to have allowed British ships to sail into Shanghai, no matter how well disguised. The British told FDR that the road being built in Burma by 200,000 coolies was for supplying China with arms and supplies to fight the Japanese, but the supplies coming from America were being shanghaied into the Golden Triangle opium trade instead of being delivered to China, and the Lend-Lease goods were being distributed throughout the 3 states in Siam that had been taken over by the British in 1909. In April of 1941, FDR signed a secret executive order creating a covert American Air Force to defend the delivery of cargo to China from the air by Curtiss C-46s. And the Flying Tigers went over to protect the airdrops of American material being given to China. And the Americans also began training Chinese troops to fight, which greatly disturbed the British, who fought the Americans at every turn, believing that if Chinese were elevated to an equal status with white soldiers, the coolies in India would soon demand equal treatment for themselves. Vinegar Joe Stilwell had fought in the Great War, and then he served 3 tours in China, where he learned to speak and write the Chinese language. And after General Stilwell took over the delivery of Lend-Lease to China in 1942, 98% of all Chinese Lend-Lease went directly through U.S. Army bases in China, rather than to the Chinese military of Chiang Kai-shek and his British handlers. The Dixie Mission was not launched until January of 1944, due to the dangerous opposition from the British, but after the colossal failure of the Bulge, all bets were off. Opium was not a painkiller, but simply made the patient oblivious to the fact that they were in pain. And to Heidegger, that would mean that they simply ceased to care about being in pain. Goering had been shot in the crotch in 1923 during the beer hall putsch, even though most history books called it his thigh. And he would never use that part of his anatomy again, which meant that his wife would have their baby girl through the new miracle of science called artificial insemination. Goering started using morphine after taking the bullet at the beer hall putsch, and he became addicted, and he would remain an addict for the rest of his life. and Goering would go in and out of mental hospitals to get off the drug for a while, but would substitute food until he went back to the morphine. Goering had been evacuated from the Great War after 5 weeks because of his arthritis, and they sent him to Freiburg to recuperate, and the shot in the groin managed to cure his arthritis. When Goering went to Sweden with his new wife, he was put into a mental hospital for 90 days, and after his release, Goering went back to the drug after 10 days, and this time his wife had him involuntarily committed, and they used a straitjacket. When Goering went to the drug treatment center this time in August of 1925, he refused to take sleeping medications for fear he would be declared insane while he slept, and they put him in a room called the Storm that had a bed bolted to the floor. And Goering was discharged from the hospital on the 7th of October in 1925 with a letter from the doctor saying there was nothing wrong with him. But the courts refused to give the Goerings custody of her son because of her epilepsy and his drug history. The following May, Goering went back to the hospital again to get off a morphine derivative they'd substituted, and this time he left with a letter from the doctor saying that he was completely cured, but his wife could still not obtain custody of the child, and Goering was dropped off the party list. He became for a time addicted to morphine, apparently because of the pain caused by his war wounds. For the rest of his life he was accused of being a permanent slave to drugs, but there is little evidence to prove that charge. His claim to have been cured of his addiction at Langbro Asylum is probably accurate. Hitler's elite, shocking profiles of the Reich's most notorious henchmen by Louis L. Snyder, New York, Berkeley Books, Hippocrene Books, 1989-1990, page 6. In January of 1927, Goering went back to Germany, leaving his wife behind in Sweden, where she was hospitalized for heart trouble and tuberculosis. And Goering got a job selling airplane engines for BMW, and his wife checked into a nursing home after selling everything they had of value. Goering went to Turkey in 1927 and was back in the Poppy Hospital in September. And the Nazis excused his use of morphine because he was taking it as the result of wounds he had acquired during their illustrious beer hall putsch. Goering went back and forth, taking morphine for a while, then using food, until he grew very fat, and the Nazis excused it as a hormone problem from having lost his testicles. When the King of Yugoslavia was murdered in 1934, Goering flew down to the Balkans in the Hindenburg dirigible, while it was still in its early design stage, and he laid a wreath inscribed, "To our noble former enemy," and Goering rode in an open car, and Belgrade loved him. When Goering had been elected to the 1928 Congress with 11 other Nazis, Goering's party card was backdated to April Fool's Day of 1928, and his wife finally died of tuberculosis, and Congress elected Goering the president of the Reichstag. There was a tunnel from Goering's office to the Reichstag building, and he was one of the first people at the scene of the fire. And as the direct result of the Reichstag fire, Goering was allowed to create the Gestapo, and he appointed Chief Müller as the most honest cop he knew. Germans learned to fear the knock at the door in the middle of the night, and so many prisoners were being kept in the dungeon at Gestapo headquarters that Goering had to build the concentration camps because the basement was filling up and he needed somewhere to send all the people being arrested by the Gestapo. With the Nuremberg racial laws of 1935, quotas replaced judicial process, and people had to go along with the quotas or get arrested themselves, and many people were shot on the spot for resisting arrest. Not only were the Gestapo able to have anyone who opposed the Nazis arrested and silenced, but the regular state procedure became that people beaten to death in protective custody were to be issued a certificate saying that they had died of a heart attack or of suicide. When he built the first concentration camp, Goering wanted to put people in them for their own protection, ostensibly to keep them safe from the wrath of the German people. And Goering's own brother Albert kept trying to help Jews and would publicly badmouth the Nazis, and Goering's brother had to constantly be rescued from the Gestapo. Goering kept himself inviolate from the extortion and corruption of the camp system by paying for all his purchases with his own cash. Corpulent and magnetic, he was the charmer with impeccable public manners who gave tone to an otherwise rough Nazi movement. They delighted in this adventurous clown who strode ponderously through the streets of Berlin with naive joy in his own power. They were inclined to agree with the massive egoist who described himself as the last Renaissance man. Delighted German burghers, with their own protruding beer bellies, found Goering irresistible. Hitler's Elite, page 10. Goering transplanted animals into his private game preserves. And he had a jacuzzi, and he liked to swim naked in his private lake, and Goering built a movie theater in his basement where he watched forbidden films like Gone with the Wind. And a comedian who told a joke about Goering's baby ended up in a camp. Goering had thought that airplanes were too complicated for Americans to mass produce, and Hitler had laughed when America declared war, and soon almost half of Goering's planes were being shot down by the Americans' superior P-51 Mustang fighter escorts. Rickenbacker had thought that $1 billion sunk into air power in 1935 would have prevented World War II, but America had been busy putting prohibition to rest at the time. When some American flyers parachuted into one of Goering's game preserves, Goering had the downed captain brought to his hunting lodge for a chat, and when Charles Lindbergh flew in to visit Goering at Carenhall, Lindbergh received a medal from him, and Lindbergh was inspired to go back and tell America that it was a good idea to invest in airplanes. In my official presentation of the Rickenbacker Plan for World Peace, I likened Germany to a tramp out of a job, hungry, poorly clothed, and desperate, practically in the gutter. Some might have said that it served the German people right, but I could not feel that way. Without apologizing for Germany's past, I distinguished between the German people with their ideals and aims, and the Kaiser and his caste, by whom the people had been led into war. German sentiment and aspirations were Republican, and I believed that we in America should help those people realize their Republican dream. It is not the American way to knock a man down and then keep kicking him. We had administered the necessary licking. It was now in our interest to lend a hand to lift the German people to their feet again, and to help them produce enough for their own needs and a surplus to pay their debts. If we did not come to Germany's aid, I could foresee some kind of dictatorship arising. Rickenbacker, His Own Story, by Edward V. Rickenbacker, Greenwich, Connecticut. Greenwich, Connecticut. Fawcett Publications, Inc., by arrangement with Prentice Hall, Inc., 1967-1969, page 291. Rickenbacker had a first-rate financial plan all worked out with his friends, but the U.S. government turned him down. In vain did I attempt to describe to our military leaders the true situation in Germany. My reports were completely at variance with those coming in from our social climbing lounge lizards, who were too busy going to cocktail parties to do their jobs. Rickenbacker, His Own Story, page 302. In Germany, Ernst Udet, the highest-scoring flying ace to survive the Great War, told Rickenbacker, "We can't afford to waste manpower or pilot time. We can't afford to waste materials. We handpick every man in the squadron, cooks, clerks, mechanics, and train them as pilots while they are doing their assigned jobs. When a pilot is transferred out of a squadron, we move the next qualified man into his place." Rickenbacker, His Own Story, page 299. When I said that the Germans were making pilots out of cooks, mechanics, drivers, and the like, they refused to believe me. "Eddie, you're nuts," one of them said. "It can't be done. You can't make qualified pilots out of mechanics." In vain I pointed out that I myself had been a mechanic, and that I had had a most difficult time getting into the air service in World War I, because I was not a college graduate, but that I had managed to do all right. But I was talking to deaf ears. Our military leaders had their own ideas of training. Rickenbacker, His Own Story, page 302. In the early part of 1939, however, I decided that, if anyone in the United States would be receptive to the truth, it would be this group of far-sighted, intelligent, successful men. In my speech I said that the day would soon come when the United States would be plunged into war whether or not we wanted it. Our participation would not be restricted to money and munitions, but rather to men, money, and munitions. And, gentlemen, I mean millions of men. During the entire speech, members of the club sat stolidly. Usually when I speak there are interruptions of applause. On that occasion there was not one. When I'd finished and sat down, there was a full 10 seconds of silence before a perfunctory round of hand-clapping began. Some years later, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. asked me to be the guest of honor at a dinner at the Metropolitan Club in New York. Referring to that economic club dinner at which he had been present, he said, "I am glad to be able to offer Eddie Rickenbacker my apologies. He was right, and we were wrong." Rickenbacker, His Own Story, page 302 and 3. If I could not obtain government cooperation, then I would have to go at the problem in my own way. If the government would not train large numbers of men for aviation, or encourage the establishment of at least potentially greater aircraft production, then it would be up to the commercial airlines to do so. By selling air travel, by increasing both mileage and service, by working constantly to perfect the reliability of commercial aviation, we could establish nuclei of production and training that could be expanded when the need arose. Even when the government was flying the mail, I believed that a great impetus for aeronautical development would come from the commercial airlines. I made the proposal that every city with a population of 25,000 or more establish a municipal airdrome at civic expense. Establish a municipal airdrome at civic expense. On the official completion of the airdrome, the city would then be connected with the national network of airmail routes. Rickenbacker, His Own Story, page 303 and 4. In 1939, we were tragically unprepared for high-speed production of airplanes of any kind. An adequate training program for future engineers and technicians in the aircraft industry did not exist. In Germany at that time, for example, there were dozens of schools for aviation instructors alone. We did not have one. We had an aviation research center at Wilbur Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Germany had 5. I knew that we would never gain public support for an armaments race, even in 1939. The remedy I proposed was to tie in this large increase with the everyday conditions of American life. The answer would be to utilize the one strategic factor that no other nation has, our immense commerce. We carried on 1/2 the business of the entire world. The method? Carry all first-class mail by air. This move would stimulate the immediate production of a fleet of 50,000 planes. Equally important would be increased training of pilots. Of all the services, land, sea, and air, only the Air Corps lacked a nucleus of personnel and the means of training additional pilots. As I pointed out repeatedly in the 1930s, there should have been a West Point of the air. Until the establishment of such an academy, and it was not founded until 1959, an increase in commercial flying would provide an excellent advanced training program for pilots. Rickenbacker, His Own Story, page 305 and 6. The railroads complained, but airplanes were coming of age, and the U.S. Army Air Force would commandeer C-47s from the private airlines and paint them gray and remove the passenger seats and build a solid cargo deck inside. And in January of 1936, the U.S. Army Air Force ordered 13 flying fortresses from Boeing, and 300,000 airplanes later, Rickenbacker's vision became the United States Air Force Academy. The Air Force Academy, or USAFA, USAFA, had ultra-modern glass buildings and futuristic military facilities and housing painted in bold primary colors, and the chapel was space-age construction, designed with a soaring cathedral pointing towards the sky that resembled a squadron of praying hands, and they kept the Catholics in the basement and the Protestants upstairs in the main hall, and they built a synagogue nestled down in the basement with the Catholics. The first cadet class at the Air Force Academy was sworn in for the fall semester of 1955, and more people flew airplanes across the ocean by 1956 than went on ocean liners. And instead of 6 days, with an airliner it took 6 hours to cross the Atlantic, and now ships were out and airplanes were in, and it had been the Air Force, not the Navy, that had turned the tide of Hitler's war. The chief difficulty at this time in solving the international aspects of the problem lies in the fact that our own government has so far reached no decision as to its domestic policy covering American aviation interests engaged in international traffic. Is there to be unlimited competition between such American interests? Can the government provide them with sufficient support if, as purely private corporations, they are obliged to compete abroad with foreign aviation interests which are government-owned and government-operated? Can American companies survive foreign competition if they are not subsidized to the extent to which foreign air transport lines are subsidized? The Time for Decision by Sumner Wells, New York, Harper & Brothers, Publishers, 1944, page 411. The first known airplane flight had been in 1903, when one of the Wright brothers flew his aircraft that had a 40-foot wingspan and a 12-horsepower engine burning gravity-fed gasoline. And the plane weighed 605 pounds and flew for the first time on December 14, 1903, even though it was only for 3 seconds. And the brothers continued to increase that time until they managed to stay aloft for 40 minutes in 1905. The Wright brothers showed their plane to the Army, who asked if 2 men could fly in the Wright brothers' plane so that one person could drop bombs or fire a gun. And on May 14, 1908, the first fixed-wing aircraft carried a passenger in a contest that was sponsored by the Army. One of the Wright brothers demonstrated his airplane to the Army by flying for 62 minutes in September of 1908, and 2 weeks later he took a passenger along in hopes of obtaining a big contract, but the propeller snapped off and the plane crashed, and the passenger died, and after the crash the U.S. Army required the wearing of football helmets for flight, and the lieutenant who died had just survived the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. Zeppelin balloons started passenger service from Friedrichsruhe in Dusseldorf in 1910, and the first use of airplanes for aerial bombing was in 1911 against the Islamic Turks, who lost, after which the British had to ask the Kaiser's permission to sail into the Black Sea. The first international competition for sailplanes and gliders was held in 1937 at Wasserkuppe Hill in Germany. And in the spring that year, Germany's planes bombed Guernica. Goering was flying as one of the pilots in the first great experiment in substantive aerial bombing on the 26th of April in 1937, and to make it look more effective, squads of commandos set substantial fires on the ground in Guernica. Goering had been born in Bavaria, and Goering's father was the first governor of the German Protectorate of West Africa. And Goering had been a delightful, adorable baby, and an extremely handsome young man. Goering lived the first 3 years of his life with family friends while his parents were diplomats in Haiti. And Goering's mother was 20 years younger than his father, and she'd been his second wife. Goering's mother fell in love with a rich Jewish man who invited the Goerings to his Bavarian castle, and while the affair went on, young Goering heard an earful about it from his father, and Goering blamed his mother for betraying the family to a Jew, even though his mother's Jewish friend had been very kind to the young Hermann Goering. Goering was turned down when he applied to flying school, so he went anyway, and Goering invented aerial bombing and won the Blue Max, that was Germany's highest honor. And when the Red Baron was shot down in the Great War, Goering took his place and became a huge hero, and his picture was put onto postcards. And after the Great War, Goering flew all over in his own small airplane. Count Erich von Rosen rented Goering's plane in February of 1920 to get to his castle in Sweden, and the castle was called Rock Elstad and had swastikas adorning the fireplace, irons from the previous century, because the swastika was an ancient Nordic symbol for the rising sun. And Goering met the Countess von Fock, who was half Swedish and half Irish, and her mother had come from a family of Irish brewers. Goering bit the Countess's hand, and she rubbed salt into the wound, and they fell in love, and Countess von Fock was 5 years older than Goering, and she left her son to live with him in Germany, even though she was already married. And when Goering checked into the Nuremberg jail on the 20th of May in 1945, he was 53 years old and weighed 264 pounds, and his fingernails and toenails were painted. And Goering had 20,000 Paracodin pills with him and was taking 40 every day. Some of the pills were mailed to the FBI in America, who told the jailers how to withdraw him safely, and 3 months later, Goering was off the drug and had lost 1/3 of his weight. The Nuremberg jail was a hotel that had the windows replaced with plexiglass and the carpet removed, and among the possessions Goering was allowed to keep was a gold cigarette case monogrammed by Prince Paul of Yugoslavia that some believed was where he hid a cyanide capsule he would use after the guilty verdict was read, and his request to be shot rather than hanged was denied. Goering wanted to die as a soldier by firing squad instead of on the gallows like a criminal, and so he was able to die as a soldier more like Hannibal, even though it was cyanide rather than opium. And when Goering had been found guilty, he was convinced that the whole trial had been merely politics. Goering didn't want a lawyer, he wanted a decent translator, but the other defendants got lawyers right away. The lower-class defendants wanted lawyers who didn't sound Jewish. It would have been much better if Goering hadn't been so uncooperative. The rest of them could be tolerated, but Goering wanted to humiliate everybody and act like a buffoon. Confronted with military matters, Goering testified, "Of course I considered our treaties as so much toilet paper. I wasn't running a girls' finishing school." Hitler's Elite, page 17. "I just want to defend myself on one point where my honor is involved. I never gave command for these atrocities. Do you suppose that I'd have believed it if somebody came to me and said they were freezing experiments on human guinea pigs, or that people were being forced to dig their own graves and be mowed down by the thousands? I would have said, 'Get the hell out of here with that fantastic nonsense.' My God, I shrugged it off as enemy propaganda." Hitler's Elite, Ibid. As the months and years of Nazi successes clicked by, Goering became one of the richest people in the world, and he admitted that he knew very little about economics, and in response to the guns or butter debate, Goering would say that guns made Germans powerful, but butter only made Germans fat. Goering thought that his contribution to the Reich was collecting art rather than building airplanes, and after his daughter was born, Goering hung out with his new wife and child instead of seeing that his jets got into the air. Mengelé's medical experiments were Mengelé's medical experiments were focused on genetic inheritance after his early work on artificial insemination that had produced Goering's daughter. And not only was Hitler's sperm frozen, but so was Himmler's and Goebbels', so Goebbels didn't mind so much the death of his children in 1945, just the same as any other high Nazis who lacked offspring, because they had plenty of frozen potential children hidden safely away. Goering had been Hitler's left-hand man, and when Goering surrendered, it had been many months since a single German plane had been able to fly in combat. An American guard named Tex made friends with Goering in the Nuremberg jail, and Tex had been given a photograph autographed by Goering. To the great hunter from Texas, along with a nice pair of gloves, a solid gold fountain pen, a solid gold cigarette case, and a solid gold watch, and the pen in the watch had been inscribed with Goering's signature. After the trial, Goering asked Tex for a bottle of whiskey, and the Americans gave him some, and that's what made people believe that Tex had smuggled in a cyanide capsule to Goering. Goering had written a suicide note, thanking God for the opportunity to die in peace without death by hanging that would be recorded on film. And Goering also wrote a letter explaining how he had kept the cyanide carefully hidden, and he described where there were 2 other capsules still hidden away in order to keep his American friend out of trouble. And the 3rd capsule was never found, while the 2nd was stuck into his skin cream and could have been put there by Tex as a decoy. Truman signed the National Security Act in July of 1947 to keep all the military types employed, and the NSA created the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the CIA. And the CIA started flying Air America and then set up the Castle Bank in the Bahamas, and 3 banks would grow out of this one: the Nugan Hand Bank of Australia, the World Finance Corporation, WFC, and the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the BCCI. With these ripe financial institutions made so available to them, the Democrats and their Anglophile CIA fellow travelers got in bed with British spies in the Golden Triangle, right after the Japanese had gone back to their home island to enjoy MacArthur's reforms, and the Republicans sided with the French and France in an attempt to get them back on their feet after Hitler's war, because the French had been instrumental in putting America first towards victory in 1945. The French in Vietnam had been living off the poppy trade for many years, while the French in France were not trusted by the CIA for their having failed to keep Hitler out of their bistros. The French in France were not trusted by the CIA for their having failed to keep Hitler out of their bistros. The French had dispersed far and wide when Napoleon had flung democracy throughout Europe, and Napoleon had been like a modern Roman offering the conquered people citizenship. And when France had lost its foothold in India to the British East India Company during the Carnatic Wars, they had moved further away into the jungles of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. The people of Vietnam had borne the burdens of colonialism for over 80 years, and they were weary of them. The communists offered the allurements of quote-unquote a new way of life. The democracies offered nothing, though they had the greatest things to offer, justice and freedom. I do not mean to imply that communism was quote-unquote voted into power, but it did not meet with intelligent or indeed any other kind of opposition. Deliver Us from Evil by Thomas A. Dooley, M.D., New York Berkeley Publishing Corp. By arrangement with Farrar, Straus and Cudahy, 1956, page 150.